First and foremost, big thank you to the Securities Commission for inviting me to moderate this panel and putting together this amazing panel. So I think a lot of us, when we talk about e-KYC, there's this kind of perception that e-KYC is not the sexiest thing. No, it's like, sometimes like, oh, security, e-KYC is a little bit boring. But I often like to challenge that notion because I believe that prosperous digital economy requires trust, requires security. And it's kind of an oxymoron to talk about digital banking, talk about digital services when you have to physically show up and onboard yourself. So I think that's very key. And Clare was actually talking about Money Match earlier, which is funny because earlier I think I tried out the Money Match services. And just to kind of signify the importance of e-KYC, I think in their earlier services, they kind of have backed up like 30 to 40 customers to actually be onboarded. But with Onfido services, I believe that's much faster these days.
Yeah, it's up to about 60 an hour. It used to be 4 an hour for 15-minute video calls. So quite a big change for them. But I completely agree. I think users are used to interacting with on-demand services now. E-commerce, Grab, all those kinds of things online, and they expect the same thing from their financial services. And for new companies like Money Match, like BigPay in this space, they need to compete on user experience just as much as on product.
Of course, sure. And before we really kick off the panel, I'd like to give Dhiraj a chance to kind of introduce himself and kind of talk about what IDEMIA does as well.
Thanks, Vincent. My name is Dhiraj Pai. I'm the APAC Sales Director for IDEMIA. Now, IDEMIA is a company, we are specialized in digital identity and biometrics. So we have delivered projects like Aadhaar for India, the National Digital ID program, as well as we power the biometrics for Changi Airport Terminal 4, the facial recognition which allows you to go from the entrance of the airport all the way till boarding. So yeah, that's quick.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah.
So I guess let's go back to the theme of the discussion, right? We're talking about whether e-KYC is convenient or intrusive. And I can think of no better example than China, right? Where they have facial recognition payments and they have this potentially dystopian kind of social credit system. So I'd like to get the panelists to kind of comment on that scenario in China as a backdrop about convenience and intrusiveness of digital identity.
Well, in my opinion, every technology has these same challenges, right? You could use it for a good purpose or for, control. Now, the same type of technology using, facial recognition in India, the Aadhaar program is used to deliver services, subsidies, government, grants to the lowest segment of the population, I mean, people who have not been included, and using digital identity and facial recognition, they were able to onboard almost like 56 million new bank accounts in a very short period of 3 months.
I guess ultimately it's how you use the technology.
Absolutely.
Right? Like a knife is just a knife, depends on what you use it for. Matt, any comments on that?
No, I just feel that, being a banker from the beginning and coming actually from, the old way of doing this, it feels a little bit scary in a sense that where you connect your face to your transactions and you get the traceability of everything that you do. So that is one thing to bear in mind from the more kind of individual perspective. That you actually are sharing your face and you leave a pattern every day.
Would you personally use a facial recognition payment?
I would, but still, it's from a practical point of view. I think this is the way things will be. But there is also another aspect of it that you actually are showing and sharing all the time. That if you think about it, it doesn't necessarily feel good.
I feel like it's an inevitable march towards that direction because even as we speak in Malaysia, I'm aware of some trials that's happening in certain parts of Malaysia to test facial recognition payments. So I feel like we can't really fully avoid that. Maybe Claire, you have anything to comment on that?
I would defer to the regulator. I think this is why it's so important for regulators to be as engaged as the Securities Commission are, as BNM are here in Malaysia, and really understand and get under the skin of these technologies. If you interact with the market, you're not going to have a situation like you do in some other countries where the market is just 10 years ahead of the regulator. The regulator's out of control, and this is where, less desirable outcomes can come from technology. But yeah, with this level of engagement, I think you can do it in a controlled way, you can do it in a fair way, and you can use biometrics, you can use data to help the population to enable people to access services rather than blocking them.
You're not just saying that because they're both in the room, right?
No, I'm not.
Okay. So actually, I want to kind of go back to a point that Matt's brought up during his presentation. So we speak about 1.5 billion people in the world without a digital identity. And I think there's a big role in terms of identity inclusion for financial inclusion, right? Mm-hmm. So I think perhaps, Dhiraj, you might be in a good position to comment on that because you did a little bit of the project with Aadhaar, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so maybe for countries like, for example, Philippines, who do not yet have a national ID, what do you suggest the approach to be like for those governments?
From a regulatory or a government perspective, what India did was, there were two ways that you could address the problem of bringing people into a financial inclusion scheme, to get people banked. One is to go back and give birth certificates to everyone and start the process of building a physical ID. Or you could leapfrog and basically go straight to a national digital ID, if you may. So what India did in their, in their ecosystem is to go straight for digital ID. In Philippines, currently, they do not have a national ID. They have about 15 or 16 documents which perform that role. So, in my opinion, going straight for digital ID would be one sure way to make sure that the bottom 40% of people are covered.
Yeah, and I think that's important. That illustrates that the importance of e-KYC is not just for the sake of a seamless experience, but it's also a big part of financial inclusion. Considering that Philippines is probably like, if I remember correctly, it's like probably like 63% unbanked or something like that.
Yep.
Yeah. So I have a lot more questions, but unfortunately we have about 10 minutes left. If it was up to me, I'd lock all the doors and nobody gets to go out, and we'll discuss until next week about e-KYC. But let's get to some of the questions by the audience. So the top question we have here speaks about the different smartphone capabilities. So how does Onfido tackle the challenge of a client having a low resolution camera?
That's a really good question. There's two factors you have to think about. You have to think about the size of your SDK, the size of your software development kit, and then obviously the quality of the camera. We do provide guidance on kind of limits there. And obviously if a camera is not good enough quality to read a document or read a face, that's not going to work. But it's not been a challenge for us in Malaysia so far. It's not been a challenge for us in the Philippines, where we work with, microcredit providers like Tala. So yeah, it's something we have to be aware of, but it's not something that holds us back so far.
Just to kind of add on to Claire's point, I think we've evolved a lot since the first iPhone came out, where smartphones are expensive. Right now, it's relatively cheap. There's a lot of lower, middle-end models that I believe should be able to fulfill those requirements by Onfido, correct?
Yeah, correct. And you also have situations where if somebody doesn't have a smartphone, they'll have to obviously access one, but you can use somebody else's smartphone, or you can use a tablet, for example. We work a lot in the rental car space, where you can go into, for example, a Europe car kiosk and use a tablet there to verify your identity. So going back to the point I made in my keynote earlier, it's got to be something that's device agnostic. It's got to be something you can use across lots of things, not just a smartphone.
And the next question is relating to GDPR and PDPA, which is the Malaysian version of the Privacy Act. So are there any constraints relating to the use of biometric verification? And what practical measures should company take to comply with these legislations? Anyone would like to take the question?
I think you have to allow users to get their data deleted if they want to. Obviously, there's more nuance to that, and lawyers will charge a bigger fee than just that to advise you. But yeah.
Cool. And the next question is relating to national digital ID. I think our Minister Gobind Singh actually announced last year some plans for, was it last year or earlier this year? But anyways, there were some plans for some national digital ID. So the question from the audience is it better to have a national vision versus a fragmented e-KYC implementation? Would anyone like to take the question? Go ahead, Matt.
I think, I mean, if Malaysia as a country would like to have a solution in place that really is accessible for all and that all will benefit from it, I think that you should do this together with some of the major banks, but also together with the authorities. From the beginning, I think this initiative should be driven by the authorities, of course. But the larger banks can be very, very strong partners in actually getting this accessible to the market. So, and they also have a strong history of actually doing KYC on the customers. And they cover most of the population, including the Islamic part of the population.
Anything to add to that, Dhiraj?
Well, my view on the National Digital ID framework is it cannot be a static framework. When the government typically does it, it is a single-time capture, okay? So your ID is not static. Your ID keeps moving. It keeps evolving. Because of that, I believe that the framework or the National Digital ID needs to be a true public-private partnership. Like Mats was mentioning, the banks need to be involved, the telecom operators need to be involved, fintechs. All of these guys need to be involved in this because your identity is defined by the attributes of your identity. And these attributes are different when it comes to banks, different for telcos, and different for the government. So from a framework perspective, that's what I feel. Public-private partnership.
All right, wonderful. Here's an amusing question for a change. So there are two questions here. One is relating to the advancement of plastic surgery and how that will affect Face ID security, and also thoughts on the identical twins as well. Would anyone in the panel like to comment on that?
Sure.
I guess more for you, Claire.
Yeah. So yes, people can get plastic surgery and change the shape of their face. Ideally, they would also then update their passport or their IC photo. Otherwise, they're going to find themselves in trouble, not just when they're trying to get a loan, but also when they're trying to, move borders, go abroad, etc. The second one on identical twins is something that people ask a lot, but it's really a small edge case. There are not many identical twins. And there are not many identical twins, if any identical twins, who try to steal the identity of their twin. If they are truly identical, the only way of testing them, seeing them apart is doing a DNA test. That's not really feasible on a big scale or a cheap scale. Banks don't do it today. When you go in and get into a branch to get a bank account, they don't, take your blood or anything. If I had an identical twin and I wanted to commit fraud, the last person I would try and do, the last identity I'd try and steal is my twins because it's so easy to trace back.
I don't know, Claire, have you heard of evil twins?
It's possible.
But I guess for me, I need to update as well because just a few years back, I had a full set of hair, right? So
that's okay. Your features are still the same. Machine learning doesn't look at your hair. It looks at distance between features.
That's somehow comforting. Mats, you want to add a comment?
Yes. I talked about the security platform as a foundation, and then you use biometrics on top of that. And depending on the situation, what you're trying to do, if you're just logging in to view something, or you're actually doing some kind of transaction that you, by any reason, would like to increase the security level, you can combine facial recognition with eye biometrics. So, you should have a system that is actually adoptable, where you can actually use different layers. So, and basically you can get up to military security level by combining a lot of stuff here.
But I suppose that wouldn't be proportional, would it?
Absolutely. Again, security and convenience.
Yeah.
There's always a trade-off.
Yeah, that's always a trade-off, yes.
But I also like to challenge that notion that security and convenience is always a trade-off, because I think part of the reason why that exists is because security teams, and correct me if I'm wrong, like a lot of times in banks, security teams don't get involved from the start of the design process. So a lot of times they don't often think about the user experience, the UI. So I feel like, you know, that kind of transition needs to be made for security to be baked in, all these questions and considerations for them to be put in the design process. What do you guys think about that situation?
I think you can really clearly see it with the difference between startup fintechs and traditional players. Before I worked for Onfido, I was on the founding team of a large peer-to-peer lending platform in the UK. And the two main challenges that we faced in launching this, and this is consistent across many fintechs, is trust. So you have to go above and beyond with security. And user experience. You have to offer users something that's so different from the status quo that they want to switch. And so those two things are in your mind at every step of every single product you're creating. And so, yeah, as Vincent said, they're baked in from the beginning. With banks, because often they have legacy systems, legacy customer bases, etc., they're trying to retrospectively fit these things on, and it makes it much more challenging.
Wonderful. So the next question is relating to how KYC is predominantly more consumer focused. So one of the audience member would like to know what the opportunities are in terms of KYC towards entities and enterprises. Is there any gaps that you guys feel is not sufficiently plugged at the moment with the system?
With regards to identity management, that is, I think the question is going more towards identity management rather than pure e-KYC. So if you have the identities of your consumers mapped out, you could then provide a third-party service to authenticate people. For example, okay, that's one use case, wherein a third party who is not a trusted party could primarily call into your systems and say, is this guy Vincent? And you are just responding with a yes, no, or does not exist in my database. So that's one typical type of use case that you could do using identity management.
Sure, perfect. Yeah. Unfortunately, it seems that we have run out of time. So I would like to invite the panelists to offer a closing thought, one by one. Maybe we start with Claire and towards this direction. Any closing thoughts, Claire?
I think for me, I'm very excited to be here in Malaysia. I'm very excited by the engagement, as I mentioned before, of the regulators in the market in how KYC is evolving and how they want to be a part of it. I think the crucial thing, and the panel touched on this earlier, is to think about when you're creating new digital identity systems, who are the stakeholders involved and what are their intentions? So yes, banks and fintech should be consulted, but so should consumers. And yeah, it's up to the regulators to make sure we do this securely and effectively.
All right, thank you, Claire. Mads?
Yeah. On one hand, today, we have the technique, so you actually, as an individual, could onboard to a platform, to a digital identity platform, or onboard to a bank without actually visiting any offices. So you could do that through biometrics and other stuff. On the other hand, we have back home large banks that have access to that technology, but they still say that you as a customer have to come into our branch office to verify yourself. So we are in the midst of these two things. And I think it's very, very exciting to have the access to the technology, but we still have a kind of a generation issue between both people and the techniques.
Thank you, Matt. Lastly, Dhiraj, anything to add?
A quick one would be that we are in a catch-22 situation today between the regulations and user convenience or usage of digital identity / biometrics. So my only request is to keep your mind open and to embrace where this technology is going. So between the three of us, I think we have given you a quick brief of where it's going towards. So yeah, keep an open mind.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
With that, it only leaves me to thank the Securities Commission, the audience, the panelists for this short but lovely time we had together. Ladies and gentlemen, can we get a round of applause for the panelists?